A policy once praised for protecting American jobs is now blamed for factory shutdowns, mass layoffs, and soaring car prices. So what really happened? In today's video, we'll break down the ripple effects of former President Donald Trump's controversial tariff policy. Is it a bold strategy or a costly mistake? Disclaimer: this content is for analysis and educational purposes only and does not represent any political stance or organization. Let's approach the topic with an open and objective mindset. Industry collapse, silent factories, silenced workers. The 25% tariff policy on imported cars and auto parts, introduced by former President Donald Trump, was once hailed as an economic shield meant to revive domestic manufacturing. However, reality has painted a starkly different picture. Instead of creating jobs, the policy ignited a severe manufacturing crisis that has rippled across North America. The automotive industry, a cornerstone of the economy in states like Michigan, Ohio, and Kentucky, is now facing an existential crisis, no longer just a looming threat. The tariffs triggered a sharp rise in production costs, particularly for companies dependent on cross-border supply chains, such as Stellantis, the multinational manufacturer behind iconic brands like Jeep, Dodge, Ram, and Chrysler. As component costs soared under the new duties, Stellantis was forced to shut down several factories in the US, Canada, and Mexico. That translated into thousands of workers being laid off, placed on temporary leave, or facing the grim prospect of long-term unemployment. Notably, the shock wasn't just about rising costs. It also shattered the finely tuned rhythm that modern manufacturing demands. Today's factories are engineered to function as seamless chains, where every part and every second is meticulously calculated. A single taxed or delayed component can topple the entire system like a domino effect. So while Trump emphasized his intention to bring jobs back to Americans, in reality his policies pushed American workers, and those at critical assembly points in Mexico and Canada, into a state of unemployment, instability, and emotional crisis. Stellantis is not alone in this downward spiral. A host of other manufacturers are facing similar predicaments, unable to maintain stable output. Meanwhile, a growing sense of anxiety is spreading among workers, many of whom once believed the Trump administration would stand up for them, now feeling abandoned. Job loss is more than just a paycheck disappearing. It's the collapse of a sense of security, a loss of faith in the sustainability of an economy that was once a symbol of American pride. And you? If Trump says he's bringing back jobs again, would you apply or just update your resume and run? From common car to luxury item, the price of exclusion. One of the clearest and most irrefutable indicators of the Trump-era tariff policy's failure is the unprecedented surge in car prices, an increase far exceeding even the most pessimistic inflation forecasts. Vehicles like the Jeep Compass and Ram 1500, once synonymous with American working-class resilience, praised for their durability, versatility, and affordability, are now slipping beyond the reach of the very people they were originally built to serve. With prices rising between $6,000 and $15,000 per vehicle, this is no longer just about numbers on a sticker. These are invisible yet brutally tangible barriers that prevent millions of Americans from accessing what has long been considered essential to daily life. The automobile is no longer merely a mode of transportation. It is becoming a symbol of social status. Who can afford one and who cannot? This crisis didn't happen by chance. It's the direct outcome of a tangled chain of disruptions: rising parts costs due to tariffs, post-COVID supply chain breakdowns, and manufacturers being forced to relocate production to tariff-free zones like Mexico, thereby incurring added expenses in logistics, customs, and extended delivery times. In an effort to stay competitive, some car makers have cut features, downgraded materials, or stripped away technology to keep prices reasonable. Yet, paradoxically, prices have continued to climb, while quality has clearly declined. The social implications of this price shock run far deeper than any raw data might suggest. In the US, cars represent more than just transportation. They are symbols of independence, economic opportunity, and the ability to earn a living. When a pickup truck, long seen as the emblem of the American worker, crosses the $50,000 threshold, this ceases to be a story about inflation. It becomes a story about the reshaping of social identity. The working class, those once promised protection by tariff policies, are now being pushed out of the very market they once drove. The absence of a car imposes real-world constraints on everyday life. It limits access to jobs in distant industrial zones, makes it harder to get children to school on time, and restricts the ability to reach healthcare or part-time work in suburban areas. These seemingly small obstacles, when accumulated, form an overwhelming barrier to upward mobility and quality of life for millions of households. Meanwhile, the used car market is overheating like never before. Consumers, left with no better option, are clinging to vehicles that are decades old, absorbing ever-increasing maintenance and repair costs, despite growing safety risks and fuel inefficiencies. The American auto industry, once a symbol of national pride, is facing an ironic twist. People are paying more and getting less. The greatest irony of all, the very tariffs intended to protect American workers are now excluding them from the market, transforming them from participants to bystanders, from workers who need vehicles to survive into outsiders who simply can't afford to participate. Owning a car, once a given in American life, is now becoming a privilege reserved for those who can afford the premium. And that says everything about the failure in the policy mindset of this era. Crisis of trust, leadership doubts, and economic chaos. In times of uncertainty, what people seek from a leader isn't grandstanding or lofty speeches, but empathy, presence, and decisive action to ease economic pain. Yet instead of steering the nation through the storm, former President Donald Trump appeared to take a different route, leveraging the chaos sparked by his own policies as a stage to reinforce his personal image and raise funds for his upcoming campaign. As thousands of Americans stood in line to apply for unemployment benefits and major automakers announced factory shutdowns, Trump continued to host flashy campaign rallies touting "Make America Great Again." These events cost millions in lighting, sound, and media production, while millions of citizens struggled to pay rent or afford basic groceries without adequate emergency assistance. The brutal contrast between the political stage and everyday reality has left many feeling betrayed. The slogan, "America First," once a rallying cry for patriotism and economic revival, now rings hollow to many, perceived not as a genuine national commitment, but as a marketing tool for one man's re-election bid. As public trust wanes, so too does confidence among investors and businesses. The stock market grows increasingly volatile, reflecting fears over erratic, emotionally driven decision-making. Consumer confidence continues to plummet, revealing deep skepticism about the future and a growing sense that policies are no longer based on sound economics, but on short-term political gain aimed at appeasing a loyal voter base. What emerges is a full-blown crisis of trust, not just between government and people, but between the federal administration and the business community, and even between the U.S. and the international stage. In a globalized world where credibility and stability are invaluable assets, a leadership style rooted in confrontation and personalized power can undo decades of nation-building in just a few short years. When policies are crafted not for the public good, but for electoral victories, when the goal is political wins rather than national recovery, the outcome is inevitable: collapsing trust, weakened foundations, and a future overshadowed by instability. To me, the most alarming part is the precedent this sets. When a leader turns economic crisis into campaign theater, it shows that public suffering is treated as a political tool, not a problem to solve. That's not leadership, it's exploitation. I believe the biggest damage isn't economic, but institutional. When trust erodes among citizens, investors, and allies, a nation faces not just a downturn, but a credibility crisis. And no slogan or tariff can fix that. Broken trade ties, neighbors clash, outsiders gain. For decades, the North American trade triangle, comprising the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, was a model of effective regional integration. The USMCA agreement, as successor to NAFTA, once stood as proof of a seamless, efficient, and sustainable supply chain that allowed North American economies to grow together. Yet, in a matter of years, the Trump administration's unilateral and hardline tariff policies shattered that model. The imposition of a 25% tariff on cars and auto parts imported from Canada and Mexico was more than just an industrial blow. It was a diplomatic affront that deeply eroded trust among America's closest partners. Rather than respond with rhetoric alone, Canada struck back strategically and precisely, targeting the critical weak spot of American industry: Rare resources essential for electric vehicles and high-tech manufacturing, such as lithium, cobalt, nickel, and key components for battery production. These materials may not be flashy, but they are the lifeblood of the modern industrial economy. Mexico, too, chose not to retaliate loudly, but instead tightened export controls on auto parts and electronics, critical supplies for U.S. manufacturers who rely heavily on southern cross-border flows. Without issuing a formal trade war declaration, both neighbors effectively choked the economic pipeline, quietly but with maximum impact. As the U.S. scrambled to respond to the backlash from its neighbors, China and the European Union seized the moment. China not only expanded its investments in Mexican factories, using them as backdoors to bypass U.S. tariffs, but also cemented its role as a key supplier of affordable EV components, batteries, and electronics to Latin America and Africa, gradually reclaiming global influence that the U.S. is now forfeiting. Europe, led by Germany and France, followed a similar path. Investment plans once earmarked for the U.S. were redirected to Canada and Mexico, nations seen as stable and non-confrontational trade partners. As longtime allies began to view America as an unreliable player, they simply pivoted. And with each factory built or billion-dollar project relocated outside the U.S., America took another step back in the global race. Most troubling is the strategic isolation now forming in the U.S.'s own backyard. North America, once an economic fortress with Washington at its center, is undergoing a quiet restructuring. Neighboring countries are redesigning supply chains to be more autonomous and decentralized, while the U.S. is being edged out of its core leadership role. In an era where global trade depends on trust, stability, and long-term cooperation, a U.S. government driven by confrontational politics and impulsive decision-making is isolating itself. And into that vacuum step the patient strategic powers, slowly but surely claiming the upper hand. Tariff fallout, a costly hit to the economy. Donald Trump's tariff policy, originally envisioned as a safeguard for domestic industry, has inadvertently turned into a failed economic experiment, costing the U.S. tens of billions of dollars. In less than 2 years since the 25% tariffs took effect, the American economy has faced a series of troubling indicators. Auto sales are projected to drop by over 2 million vehicles in 2025, tens of thousands of jobs have vanished, and consumer confidence has plunged to alarming levels. There's no denying that the auto industry plays a pivotal role in the U.S. economic structure, not just in terms of manufacturing output, but as a hub that connects a wide range of sectors, including steel, aluminum, electronics, logistics, and retail. Therefore, a steep decline in car sales hasn't just crippled automakers like Ford, GM, and Stellantis, it has triggered a domino effect destabilizing the broader economy. Even more troubling is the cascading impact of shrinking market share and downsizing production. The damage isn't confined to job losses, it extends to market psychology. Consumer confidence, which reflects the public's expectations for the economic future, has fallen to its lowest point in nearly a decade. Americans are now worried about job security, soaring prices, limited access to credit, and as a result, they're cutting back on spending, dragging down overall consumer demand. These dynamics have combined into a classic recessionary spiral: rising production costs, higher prices, reduced consumption, lower output, job losses, further declines in spending. But unlike past economic crises triggered by global markets or pandemics, this spiral was set in motion by a unilateral and politically motivated domestic policy. And that raises a fundamental question. Can an economy as vast and complex as the United States continue to function efficiently when its economic decisions are driven not by data, but by political slogans? Domino effect. From cars to tech, the whole economy feels it. When the automotive industry, one of the pillars of U.S. manufacturing, falls into crisis, a ripple effect across other sectors is inevitable. But what has alarmed economists is not just the spread, but the speed and magnitude of this domino effect. It's not just supply chain partners feeling the impact. Retailers, tech firms, and even fast food chains are being hit hard as consumer spending power collapses. Iconic names in American consumer culture, like Domino's Pizza, Bed Bath & Beyond, and chains selling home goods and electronics, are now facing waves of mass store closures. The root cause is shrinking purchasing power. As the cost of living soars, people are cutting back on non-essentials, from weekend pizzas to replacing household appliances. The shockwaves are especially evident in tech and retail. Companies like Best Buy, Target, and even Amazon have laid off thousands, slashed growth forecasts, and canceled expansion plans. Businesses once thought immune to economic shocks due to their global scale or online dominance are now scrambling for survival. This isn't a technical recession. It's a real and sweeping disruption dismantling some of the most stable pillars of American consumption. Meanwhile, small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs, which employ nearly 44% of America's private workforce, are suffering even more. Without the financial buffer that large corporations have, these businesses can't withstand skyrocketing input costs, declining sales, and tightening credit. Many are being forced to declare bankruptcy or drastically downsize, triggering a secondary wave of job losses across seemingly unrelated sectors like education, healthcare, and services. In short, a protectionist trade policy initially promoted as a shield for America is now proving to be a double-edged sword. With global supply chains disrupted and domestic demand in freefall, even companies eager to manufacture in America find it impossible to do so, because there are fewer consumers left who can afford what they produce. Trapped consumers, car ownership becomes a pricey dream. In the past, buying a car in America was a rite of passage, a milestone in achieving independence and financial stability. But today, under the twin pressures of soaring inflation and auto loan interest rates spiking to 6-7%, that dream is slipping out of reach for millions of Americans. Trump's tariff policy has driven up the cost of imported auto parts, while global supply chain disruptions have kept new car prices hitting record highs. At the same time, the Federal Reserve, FED, continues to maintain high interest rates to combat inflation, with a predictable result. Even consumers with legitimate needs can no longer afford to finance a new car. A 1% rise in interest rates can add thousands of dollars to the total cost of ownership, an overwhelming burden for working and middle-class households. The result is a consumer freeze, hitting the heart of the U.S. auto market. Americans are being forced to hang on to aging vehicles with hundreds of thousands of miles on the odometer instead of upgrading, despite rising costs for repairs, maintenance, and fuel. This not only paralyzes the new car market, but also indirectly affects the entire aftermarket ecosystem: garages, parts suppliers, insurers, and even consumer lending services. The stagnation in vehicle turnover is also spilling into other sectors, such as logistics, delivery services, and public transportation systems, where personal vehicles play a key coordinating role. A vicious cycle has emerged: rising prices, inability to purchase new cars, keeping old ones, rising upkeep costs, declining consumer spending, further market weakening. The irony is stark. Trump's tariff policy, touted as a solution to reindustrialize America, is now turning one of its clearest industrial symbols, American-made cars, into an emblem of luxury and financial inequality. When citizens can no longer access a basic means of transportation, it's not just their personal lives that suffer. It's the very health of the economy that begins to unravel. If your car has 250,000 miles and a duct-taped bumper, congratulations! You're officially a luxury vehicle owner now. Tourism as a political tool, when a passport becomes a symbol of resistance. In a development seemingly unrelated to tariffs and manufacturing, the U.S. tourism industry is suffering a quiet but dangerous backlash, a wave of boycotts from Canadian travelers, one of America's largest and most loyal tourist groups. But this isn't about changing tastes, it's a political statement. Following the Trump administration's imposition of a 25% tariff on automobiles and parts imported from Canada, many Canadians have responded by choosing to stay home, rather than visit the U.S. as they normally would. Hotel cancellations, dropped tour packages, and scrapped vacation plans have surged in border states like Maine, Vermont, and New York. Areas once bustling with friendly cross-border visitors now find themselves unusually quiet. While this reaction is grassroots and voluntary, it reflects a powerful shift in modern international relations. Soft power is increasingly wielded not by governments, but by individual consumers through conscious choices. With each canceled vacation and each declined trip, Canadians are sending a clear message: We reject policies that harm our neighborly ties. The economic impact is substantial. Canadian tourists typically spend billions annually in the U.S., especially in hospitality, dining, retail, and service sectors. The sudden drop in revenue has pushed many small businesses near the border into crisis. Local economies, which rely heavily on the brief tourism season each year, are now struggling to survive, all due to a unilateral trade policy. Beyond the economics, this phenomenon of tourism as political expression signals a deeper change in global citizen awareness. Travel is no longer just leisure. It has become a channel for expressing personal values, ethical stances, and national solidarity. A passport withheld, a road trip not taken, these can be louder than street protests. If this trend spreads to other regions, Europe or Asia, for example, the U.S. could face a quiet economic retreat from the international community, not through speeches, but through the silent power of choosing not to show up. The tariff policy was once expected to protect America, but in reality, it has left the nation's industries struggling, workers unemployed, and public trust in the economic system deeply eroded. Personally, I believe that when economic decisions are made to serve short-term political goals, the consequences last far longer than any presidency. What do you think? Can the U.S. truly rebuild economic trust if it continues down this path of confrontation and unilateralism? Thank you for watching until the end of the video. Leave a comment below. We always welcome constructive perspectives. See you in the next one.